Alrighty then. So, I am going to try something different here. I'm streaming as well as recording this. So, some people are following along live here, I suppose. So, if you're interested in trying this out, what I'm going to do is show you how to set up a texture swapping cycle for ring aprons, which will make them appear to be animated. So what you're going to need before we can really, or not before you can do it, but before you can test it, is you're going to have to make some graphics files. They're going to need to be named the same as whatever ring you're going to use for testing, and they need to then have a hyphen, or not a hyphen, an underscore and numbers sequentially. So, like I'll use Royal Ring for example. If you want to do Royal Ring, you need to do royalring.png, royalring underscore 2.png, royalring underscore 3.png, etc., and so on and so forth. And I believe that in my test code, I set it up so that the left and the right apron can scroll through textures individually. So if you wanted to do that, then you would have to set up the names differently, obviously, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Yes, I do upload these to YouTube as well. There are 6 or 7 of them on there already, so and they're linked in the Fire Pro Arena forum. I have a thread forum in the mod section that just says Carlzilla's tutorial videos, and I've gone through a First Blood match, a mask versus mask match. What else did I do? I think that might be it for now, but there may be more. I don't remember off the top of my head, to be honest. So, anywho, so let's dive into this. What you're going to want to do is when you bring up Visual Studio, you're going to want to go to New Project. And of course now my computer is being slow because I'm recording, and of course my phone would go off. Let's turn that off. And then what you need to do is give it a name. Obviously you're going to need to select a class library. So I'm just going to call this A&M Apron. Okay. This also might be easier to read in full screen. It is actually easier to read in full screen. I just full screened it. But I usually voice the code anyway, so it's not super important that you full screen it if you want to use the chat. Also, I am in the Modding Talk Discord channel on the Mod Suite testing ground. If you want to get on on there and ask me questions, through voice stuff. So let's get started here. We always got to do this when we start a project. You've always got to go in and change the .NET framework to 2, because that's what Unity uses. If you don't do that, you will not only screw up your mod, but if you patch it into the game, you will screw up everybody else's mod, because you will create a dependency on a much higher .NET framework. So you absolutely have to do this every time. Change that, hit OK, and then just close it out. You're good. And then I always rename class 1 because I don't like it to be called class 1. So A&M Aprons. And then yes. And it should rename it up here. So with that going, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set up. So what I decided to do with this is I wanted to use arrays to hold the textures so that they're not loaded every time they swap. You load them once at match creation and then just flip through them. It's the same way that the game deals with the the textures for the timer. It loads all 10 numbers at once at the beginning, and then it doesn't have to swap through them or load them every time it has to change a number. It just points to that texture file in the array. So we're going to need to do a texture. Oh, I got to link. The other thing you have to do before you start typing anything is link your references and clear out all of these garbage references that are left over from when we switched to 2.0. So add reference, and then you're going to browse and find your PWGR framework file, which is going to be in your FirePro Wrestling W_data folder, and then it's going to be in managed inside that. And then so you're going to need to check that off. You're going to need to check assembly C#, and if you want to link it to the mod suite, you'll have to check off Carlzilla, but you're also going to need to check off Unity Engine. So those should be the three. You should have UnityEngine.dll, assembly C#.dll, and PWGR framework.dll. Those will all be required. And like I said, you can link it to the mod suite if you want to. I don't think we need to for this one. So I'm going to go ahead and link those and then add my usings. So using DG, and that's the PWGR framework. Using Unity Engine, and that's the Unity stuff. And that we're going to also using system.io, and that's system input output. And we're going to be using that because we're going to be reading and writing files. So it's better to just have it up there. That way you don't have to reference it every time. So texture 2D or texture array, then you're going to want to give it a name. We'll call it apron text right equals new texture, and then I'm just going to say we're just going to give it a dimension of 1 because we're going to end up redefining it anyway. So, and since we did right here, let's do left here. So texture array apron text left equals new texture, and we'll give it a dimension of 1 as well because, like I said, we're going to redimension them anyway. So it's not super important that they have the correct size in the code that just kind of sets them up. So the next thing that we're going to need is we're going to want the interval in which aprons change. So that's going to be an integer number. So we'll call it text swap time, and I'm going to set that to 3 so it'll change every 3 in-game seconds. And you can set it to whatever you want. You can also, and I'll show you how to do this when I get into the actual code. I can't talk tonight. You can change it via loading a file that corresponds to the ring, so you can have some rings change faster than others, or that sort of thing. So, and I also forgot this because I'm tired. All of these need to be public static, otherwise methods that we use for the patcher won't be able to read them. So public static. And now once that's done, we're going to need a bool and two index files or 2 index integers and the mat render and the texture renderer. So the bool is public static bool, and I'm going to call it load apron, and this is going to be false to start off with. Basically, when that's true, it will run through the apron swapping technique, and we'll set it to true if it finds more than if it finds an apron file for the ring that we're using. So and now we need the ints, so we need public static int, and let's just call this texture index right, and that's going to be 0, and public static int text idx left, obviously, also 0, and then public static renderer, and not render buffer, renderer. And we'll call this matte rend because it's the matte texture renderer, and we're going to set that to null because we're going to end up checking on whether it has a null reference or not later in the code. So a renderer is what Unity Engine uses to display models, graphics, all of that stuff. So that's what, and it'll store all of the information for the ring mat and the aprons, and that's what we're going to use to change the aprons every time that our texture swap time is met. So once we've done that, we need to add a method. We don't need it down there. This is what you get for doing this when you're tired. Public static void load textures. And so this method is going to load in all of the textures that are associated with the ring. So what we're going to first want to do is we've got to figure out which ring we're using. And to do that, we need to check the... we're going to need to get the match settings. So match setting, and I just called it M setting because that's easy, equals global work dot instance dot match setting. And so what that does is the match setting file contains all of the variables that define what's happening in a match. So it will have our ring ID, and we're going to use that to query for our for the ring name, which we're going to use to load the files. So now we're going to need to go if match or M setting dot ring ID is less than 10,000, because all user created IDs start at 10,000. So if it's less than that, we don't want to do anything with it because the game will flip out, and that's not good. So just return. So basically, if the user is using the SWA ring that comes with the game, this just says don't do anything, quit. And then what we're going to want to do is check for a directory that contains the animated aprons, and if they exist, and if it doesn't exist, we're going to create it so that the user can put animated aprons in it without having to make it themselves. So to do that, you go if exclamation point directory dot exists, and then I use the directory decals or decal, which is where all of the other ring textures are found anyway, and then ANM aprons. So what it ends up being is dot slash decal slash ANM aprons slash, and so that will check and see if that exists in the default FirePro directory. And if it doesn't, it will execute this code, which is directory.create directory. And then you can just take this and highlight it all the way through the quotations and then just paste it in there. So if that directory doesn't exist, it will create that directory so it exists. That way we can query it for the texture file, or for the image files for the textures. So the other thing that we need to do is get the ring name. So this is going to be a string, and then ring name equals. And to do this, we take that. We're going to take the ID from the M setting file and check it against the save data. So we want save data.getInst, or you can just use inst. I don't know why I still use getInst from time to time, but they've removed it from some of the other code. So it's probably better just to use the static object inst instead of the method getInst. And then you've got edit ring data, which contains all of the edit ring data, and it's an array, so you're going to need to give it an index. And of course, that index is going to be msetting.ringid minus 1,000 or minus 10,000 dot name. So the ring ID, the IDs are always upped by 10,000, so they're easy to check if they're user created. But when you access them from the edit ring data array, you need to subtract 10,000 from them every time. Otherwise, you'll start getting errors unless you actually have over 10,000 created rings made, in which case you're probably a maniac, and I fear you, because that's ridiculous. Alright, so now that you've got that done, what we need to do now is default all of those things, all of these variables that we created. We want to default them at the beginning of this. That way they're reset every time a new match is loaded. So how we're going to do that is we just go and take them from up here, because this will default them one time when the game first loads the DLL, but it won't reset them every time a new match is started. So you need to manually reset all of this stuff. And the easiest way to do that is just to copy and paste them from up here. I think I missed text index. I did. Oh well, whatever. I can go up and copy it. They just won't be in the same order. Not a big deal. I also missed them. There we go. And so I'm going to leave the mat renderer because we're going to set up another method that fetches the mat renderer. So we'll reset that there because that's just an easier place to do that. So now that we've done that, and we've got all of the the directories created so that it won't freak out when it doesn't exist and we're trying to query it, what we're going to do is create a directory info, which is what C# uses to access the directory file structure. And so directory info, we'll call it, I always just call it DI. It's a habit. Basically every directory info I've ever made has been called DI because you really don't need them to stick around permanently, so you just call them in each method and then the garbage collector will clean it up when it runs its pass. So DI equals new directory info, and then we're going to query that directory we created up there. So decal /ANM aprons. And that's all you do to create the directory info. And then what we're going to need now, since we did left and right, I was going to show an easier version without left and right, but I'm not going to. What's the point? So what we're going to do is we're going to query for all of the right index file, or all of the ping files for the right apron first, and we're going to do that by going file info, and this is an array because it gets any file that fits the search pattern that we're going to give it. And then we'll just call this files right equals di.get files, and the get files method just returns anything with the particular search pattern. So the search pattern that we're going to use is ring name plus _r and then star, because we want it to find all of the the _1, _2, _3, _4. So So we want underscore r star dot png. And now we need to do it for the left. So we got file info array files left equals di dot get files, and then same thing, ring name plus underscore l star underscore l, not underscore r again, star dot png. And so that will query it for the left and the right separately. And since they have a slightly different naming convention, it won't return, the same list of files. So the other thing that we're going to need to do is, since we're redimensioning the arrays, we can't directly add these to the arrays. So we need to create two new list objects and then turn those lists into arrays. So we need list of texture, and then we'll call this text list right equals new list of texture, and then we do it for the left side as well, list texture text list L equals new list texture. So now we've got both of those defined. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add the textures to those and then turn those into arrays, which will redimension our apron text right and apron text left automatically. You could call them from the list, but I don't feel as comfortable with that because lists can be any length, and so you might end up with weird errors where you're calling things that don't exist. But since an array is a fixed length, it's easier to deal with. So now that we've done that, we need to cycle through all of the files that our get files commands returned. So to do that, you go for each, and then file info, and then you can call this whatever you want. I just say F because it's a file. In files right. And now here is this code will load a texture file from a ping file. It works. You can use this to load texture files for, I use it to load the blood textures. So it can be used for edit parts. It can be used for arena stuff. It can be used for, belt textures, but it doesn't work very well right now because belt textures are in a texture index. But technically it could be used for that. It could basically, any texture in the game can be swapped using the method I'm about to show you. So it's kind of good to know. So the first thing you're going to want to do is set up a byte. Since Unity doesn't have a way of just loading in a ping on its own, you just load it as an array of bytes. So we'll call this file data equals new byte, and then you just give it a size of 1 because it doesn't really matter how big it is because you're going to end up redefining it right below it. And so now you go file data equals file dot read all bytes f dot file name, or f dot full name, excuse me. And so that will populate the array with all of the bytes data of that particular ping file. And then we need to create a new texture 2D file. Texture 2D. And I'm just going to call this temp text because it's not permanent. Equals new texture 2D. And then give it a size of 2 by 2. You can't define a new texture 2D without giving it a size. So 2 by 2 is the smallest I think that you can do. So this just makes it real small. And then we're going to use a built-in method to expand it based on the size of the image that we're applying to it. So to do that, you go temp text dot load image file, or load image, and then remember when we loaded it into the bytes? Well, that's what you're going to want to put there. So file data, and that basically says to take the bytes that are in the file data array and create an image with it. And so that will load it into a temporary texture, which we're then going to reassign, or a temporary texture 2D, which we're then going to reassign as a texture, because you can't set a you would have to know the exact size to create a new texture file straight off, and since file size or sizes vary, it's just easier to create a texture 2D and then reclass it as a texture. So to do that, we just create a new texture, and we'll call this rtex equals new texture. Then we take rtex equals, and then in parentheses you texture, and then the temp text file. And so that turns your temporary texture into a full-on texture that Unity can use to re-image the ring apron. And then you're going to add it to the list. So text list r.add rtex. And there you go. And so what we're going to want to do now is copy that for the left. So just copy and paste the whole for each block, and then change the files right to files left. And you can change the rtex to ltex if you want. It's not important that you do. I tend to do it just for clarity's sake, I guess. And then you're going to want to change that to text list L instead of text list R, so it adds it to the left texture list instead of the right texture list. So once you've done that, it will load in every texture that you have properly named in that directory for right or left, and it will turn them all into texture files that are readable by Unity. And it will, right now they're just in a big list, and we don't really want them in a big list, we want them in an array. So we take that apron texture array, the apron text left and apron text right, and set it to equal text list r dot to array. And then we do the same thing for the right side. Apron text, or the left side, excuse me, text list l dot to array. And so that will create the texture arrays. And then we're going to want to check and make sure that there are textures loaded. And if there are, we're going to want to set that load apron boolean to true. That way we can use it to check and see if it should run further code in the next method. So what we're going to want to do is if apron text right dot length is greater than 0, and apron text left dot length is greater than 0, load apron equals true. And that's pretty much all we need to do for this particular method to do it very basically. I will probably come back and show you how to add a little like DAT file or text file that allows you to change the texture swap time to whatever you want it to be for each ring. But I will show you that after we've got the rest of this stuff done, because it's just fluff. So then we want to set up another method. So public static void, and this is going to be set mat renderer. And basically what this is going to do is we're going to set the renderer at the beginning of every match. That way we don't have to cycle through components and find it every time we want to access it, because that, I don't think it would kill anybody's computer, but it's not the most efficient way to do it. So here's where we set that matrend equals null again. I told you, remember, that we would do it in another method. Well, here's where we do it. And then we're going to check the load apron. So we want if load apron does not equal true, so if exclamation point load apron, return. Because if there's no texture files to load, we have no need for the renderer. So the next thing that we do is we need to get the ring object. To do that, you set up a ring object by typing ring, and then you give it a name. I just called mine R. It's, easy. Equals ring.inst, and that will get the match's instance of the ring so that you can access the object. And then we're going to need a bool called foundMat, and this bool will be used to exit the loop where we loop through all of the components once we find the mat renderer, because we don't need anything other than the mat renderer. So there's no reason to keep going through loaded components if we've got the one we wanted. So then you're going to want to set up a for each loop, for each, and this is a little tricky because it's, oh, my cats are killing each other. And now my wife is yelling at the kitties. Good for us. So this is straight up Unity code. This is not even FirePro stuff. So if you need any help with these commands, your best bet is to look on the Unity website in their scripting, like their scripting manual. So what we need to call is all components. So we need component, and we're going to call the component C in r.ring object, which is like the actual game object for the ring instance, dot transform, which is the actual model of that the ring object is using, dot get components in children, and then the greater than less than brackets, and we're going to look for a component. It helps if I spell transform right, though. So that's going to loop through every Unity component in the model of the ring, which is what we want, because we want to find the rendering component for the mat file, or for the mat textures. So here's how we check for that. If the component doesn't have a renderer file, so if c.get component, and you need mesh renderer here. So does not equal null. So if the component has a mesh renderer, then we're going to do stuff to it. If it doesn't have a renderer, it won't do anything. It'll just go to the next component. And so now we need renderer rend equals c.get component mesh renderer. And I know that this is a little more complicated than some of the other tutorials I've done, because it's got a lot of just straight up Unity code in it, but really it's not too bad once you kind of get the hang of the get component and all of the different Unity components and stuff. And I mean, really, for your purposes, you're not going to need a whole lot of them, so it's not too bad. And then we need an if statement. If c.name equals mat. They weren't very creative with their naming of the mat object. They just called it mat. So if that's the case, what you want to do is mat rend equals rend. So that will basically set up your mat renderer, and then you're going to want to break. And that will break out of the for each loop. So you don't even need this bool. I did it in a slightly different way in my testing project, but this will be more efficient, so just use this instead. But yeah, so this breaks out of the for each loop. So basically, if it finds the mat object, it sets the renderer to the renderer for the mat object, and then stops looping through all of this stuff. And that's really all you need. So that was a pretty short. My wife is YouTubing. But yeah, so that basically sets your mat renderer so that you can access it in the next method, which will be the last method of the entire project, which is the texture cycling method, which will make it appear like it's animated. So public static void, I called this texture cycle. And we'll go back and write the hooks here in a few minutes. I've started to not write the hooks until afterwards. Just I find it easier to write the code and then figure out where I need to put them in. So the first thing we're going to do is that if mat rend equals null, we're going to return. If there's no renderer, there's no need whatsoever to run any more code. Now, if match main.inst.isMatchEnd equals, or we don't even need the equals, so just if it's match end, or not match main.inst.isTimeCounting. And so that isTimeCounting will basically say if the clock is stopped, so like in between rounds or whatever else, it'll stop cycling, because otherwise if it ends on a second where the thing would cycle, it would just cycle endlessly and it might cause problems. So basically, if the time isn't counting, stop cycling. So we just want to return if either of those things are true, or if either of those things, is the case. So if it's the match end or the timer is not counting, we just return. And the third thing we're going to return on is if match main.inst.matchTime.second. So we're working with seconds here. So the best you can hope to do is every 1 second it will change the texture. And we want %sign and then text swap time does not equal 0. And if that's the case, we want to return as well. So that %sign is basically like a division sign that gets the remainder instead of the the quotient. So basically it checks to see if a number is divisible by another number, and if it is, it'll do code. If it isn't, in our case, we have it set that if it isn't, it will return. So this basically says every 3 seconds run code. During seconds 1 and 2, don't run code. So so there's that. And then we got one more check we're going to need to make. If match main.inst.matchtime.frm equals or does not equal 0. So what that is the frames. And by default, FirePro updates the second every 30 frames. So it runs at about 60 frames per second. So basically, every second sees 2 FirePro seconds go by. But we only want to access the code on the first frame, so frame 0, since computer programming is usually 0 indexed. So if it's the 0 frame of the second in question, then we'll do the code. If it is not the 0 frame, we'll return. That way, because otherwise it would update that code, or it would update the texture every frame until the second, or until the second changed again, and we don't want that either. So that's why we have to return there. And now we get into the more interesting code. So if load apron again. So if we have, basically what that says is if we have textures, then we want to take the matrend.materials and then materials 4, and because of my work on the ring texturing, the mat database and stuff, I know that materials 4 is the right ring texture, or the right side ring texture. If you didn't know that, you would have to load up ILSpy and go to where, either in the mod suite where I'm retexturing the ring, or where Spike retextures the ring, and find the index that you're using, or that they were using, in order to get the correct place. So now we need set texture, and this is another thing that you just kind of have to know. So Spike used a texture name, because each material can have a bunch of different textures. It's not all just one texture. So Spike used a material name of decaltex on the changeable textures. So you need to tell Unity that you want to change decaltext. So to do that, you put its name in quotations. So you want to change _decaltext, and you want to set it to apron text right, and you're going to do that for text idx right. And unsurprisingly, you're going to do the same thing, but the materials index will be 5. That's the left apron. And then, so obviously you're going to want to pull from the left apron text array, and you're going to want to use the left text index. So that will literally change the texture. That's all you need. But since we want it to actually cycle, we want to increase that index after we've changed it. So we need text idx right ++ and text idx left ++. And so that will increase it by 1 after the texture is changed. But now we need to make sure that it doesn't go outside of the bounds of the array. Otherwise you'll end up with errors, and the game will freeze, and everybody will yell at you and tell you that your mod sucks. So we need text idx right is greater than or equal to, because the length arrays are 0 index, but the length will return the total number of things in the array. So if it equals the length, you also want to set it back to 0. So what we're going to do is apron text right dot length, and then we set text idx equals 0. And then we're going to want to do the same thing with text idx left. So text idx left greater than or equal to apron text left dot length. You're going to want to set the text idx left equals 0. So that should allow you to cycle through all of the textures in an array one by one, and keep you from going outside of the scope of the array and causing yourself problems. So, and that's literally you have written every bit of code that you need to get this to work. It's a pretty short mod, actually. So now, I said I was going to show you how to make the text swap time user definable. So what we're going to need to do that is after we've got the ring name, we go down here and we go if file.exists, and then we're going to do /decal aprons / and then you go out here and plus ring name plus .dat and else. So this is going to be an if else, and the else you can just punch in now. If that file doesn't exist, text swap time equals 3, and there you go. So you're going to notice an error here because I put this in at the wrong spot. So let's copy this and put it down here, actually, because if we did it there, it would have reset the text swap time to 3, even after we set it with the dat file. So you've got to make sure not to do things like that because it's easy to do and it will screw everything up. So now that we've done that, we're just going to need to get a stream reader, which will it reads strings basically from files. So stream reader, we'll call it ring.dat rd reader equals new stream reader, and then we load the same file that we checked for. So you can just come up here and copy and paste, and that will load up that file. And then you go text swap time equals, and whenever you try to read something that is not a string from a stream reader, you need to parse it. So we're going to do int.parse rdreader.readline, and that's literally all you need to do. And then we need to kill rdreader, and we use dispose, and then rdreader.close. Anytime you're working with stream readers or stream writers, it is super important that you dispose of them and close them. Otherwise, you will get file access errors up the ass, and it will waste memory pretty heinously. So always make sure to dispose of and close them. So basically, now you have a custom, or the ability to set a custom swap time. So the only thing left to do here is to write the hooks. So for the load textures hook, I loaded them on create players, which I know fires every single time a new match is created. So it's a good place to do things that you want to do every single time a new match is created. So we go hook target class equals match main, target method equals create players, injection location equals int.maxValue, and if you remember from our other tutorials, that will basically set it up so that it throws it at the very end of the file, and this should say inject location, not injection location, not, there we go. And then we need inject direction equals dot before. You always use before if you're using 0 or max value, otherwise it will put it in weird places. So now that we've got that, you need the hook flags, so we need to go inject flags equals none. We don't need any for this particular thing. And then the group equals aprons. And so that will create the hook for the texture loading. And Obviously, it will make players' game load matches slower because it's now loading in all of these textures every single time it loads a match, which is fine, but it definitely will make things go a little slower. So then to get the renderer, so to do the renderer, we need to make sure it is done after the ring instance is set up, and the ring instance is set up after the players are set up, so we don't want to do create players again. What I did was hooked the very, very end of the awake method in match main, which is also run every single time a new match is created. So hook target class equals match main, target method equals awake, injection location equals int dot max value, injection direction equals before, injection flags equals none, group equals ANM aprons. So now we have 2 of our 3 methods hooked. So now we just need to hook the texture cycle. And I found that the best place to do this, since we're dealing with the clock, is in the matches update section. And just to do it at the very beginning of the matches update routine. So to do that, we hook, and then target class equals match main, target method equals update, injection location equals 0, because we want it at the very beginning, inject direction, that's flags, inject direction equals before, inject flags, we don't need any, and so then we just need the group ANM aprons. And that's literally it. Like I said before, you run this, you're going to want to create some texture files, and I created mine. See, if you see here, they are Royal Ring Wrestle Feast L, Royal Ring Wrestle Feast L2, or underscore L underscore 2, Royal Ring Wrestle Feast underscore L underscore 3, and then the same for the right side, Royal Ring Wrestle Feast underscore R dot ping, Royal Ring Wrestle Feast underscore R underscore 2, etc., etc. And I have a DAT file for this, and it is Royal Ring WrestleFeast.dat, and inside the DAT file, you're going to need to just put one line with the timer, with the time that you want the textures to rotate. I did 1 second, so just to test it out, and that will basically allow you to load that in and test it out and make sure it works. But if you try to do it without any of those, without any files there, it will not work. So be sure to create some silly apron files to do the testing with. Like I said, the only requirement is that it shares the ring name before the underscore R and underscore L. And technically, you don't even have to have them do the 1, 2, 3 thing. You could have them underscore R first, underscore R underscore second. It doesn't matter what you put there, just so long as you're consistent. And so it's going to load them in alphabetical order. So basically, if you were to do like if you were to type names out, you might end up with instances where 11 happens before second, because 11th would become before second in the in when the file info stuff alphabetizes the file list. So yeah, you definitely want to keep that in mind. That's why I tend to use the numbers at the end, because if everything is the same up to the numbers, it will keep them in order, especially if you use zeros trailing. So like 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. It will keep everything in order. So if you're going to go above 10, you might want to consider using zeros on all of your numbers below 10. But that's it. That should get it working with no problem. You should be ready to go at that point. So if you have questions, let me know. And if things aren't working, let me know, and we'll try to get it. We'll try to figure out what either I did wrong or you did wrong, and we'll go from there. All right. Thanks a lot.